Welcome back to our channel, Hopetales. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because today's story will shock you. She was just a passenger, until two F-22 fighter jets suddenly called her by her secret call sign. At 37,000 feet, the world beneath the aircraft looked peaceful, an endless stretch of clouds drifting, like slow waves. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into a quiet rhythm. Some watched the glowing screens in front of them, others dozed lightly, and a few leafed through magazines without truly reading them. Among them sat a woman in seat 14A, anonymous and unremarkable to anyone looking. She blended in like any other traveler on any other flight. No one knew, no one could imagine how drastically her presence would shape the hours ahead. The aircraft hummed steadily, engines pushing against the wind with effortless power. The sky was smooth, the weather clear, the route normal and uneventful. Nothing hinted at danger. Nothing hinted at the chaos waiting just beyond the horizon of the pilot's radar. And nothing hinted that this ordinary passenger carried a past she had buried deep, far from civilian life, far from anything that resembled the woman she appeared to be now. She leaned back, calm, composed, unaware that fate had already begun rewriting her day. 2 states away, at an air defense monitoring center, alarms triggered silently. A radar operator frowned at the screen, noticing something unusual. The commercial aircraft cruising steadily across his display had made an unexpected course. Deviation, subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to raise suspicion. A deviation that didn't match the filed flight plan. A deviation that didn't make sense. He marked it, flagged it, and notified his superior. Protocol was followed swiftly, mechanically, just as countless drills had trained them. Unknown deviation. Possible navigation issue. Possible pilot incapacitation. Possible hijacking. Nothing confirmed, everything uncertain. The aircraft continued on its altered heading. Back on board, passengers remained blissfully unaware. The cabin crew walked the aisle, doing routine checks. Overhead bins sat locked. Lights glowed softly. Everything appeared normal. But behind the cockpit door, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. One of the aircraft's communication systems had begun malfunctioning, and the pilots, busy troubleshooting a cascade of alarms, had not responded to several routine calls from air traffic control. To controllers on the ground, silence from a commercial airplane was never taken lightly. Minutes later, 2 F-22 Raptor fighters lifted off from a nearby base, engines roaring with raw power. Their ascent was rapid, urgent, and dangerously close to what the military classified as an active intercept response. The pilots received their instructions with precision and launched toward the commercial aircraft's coordinates. The woman in seat 14A continued staring out the window, unaware that 2 fighter jets now raced at supersonic speed toward the plane she sat in. She had known the sound of jets once, military, jets that shook the earth when they passed overhead. She had known the feeling of G-force, the pressure of the sky, the pulse of adrenaline. But that life was behind her. She had chosen to leave it, and she believed it would never follow her again. But the sky has its own rules, and fate has its own timing. As the F-22s closed in, the pilots activated their targeting systems, not to fire, but to analyze. They scanned the aircraft visually, checking for damage, signs of intrusion, anything unusual. What they saw confused them. The plane looked intact, stable, flying normally. Yet it remained off course and unresponsive. Inside the cabin, a faint turbulence made a few passengers tighten their seatbelts. No one suspected anything. No one looked out the window at the exact second the shadow of a fighter jet skimmed past the fuselage. Only one person sensed something. Seat 14A. Her eyes flickered as the strange vibration passed through the metal beneath her. Instinct recognized what ordinary passengers never could. The faint tremor, the distinct resonance of a high performance. Jet running parallel to a commercial aircraft, something she had once felt in training. Long before civilian life muted those memories, her heartbeat quickened, not with fear, but with recognition. She glanced out the window and froze. There, cutting through the clouds like a blade, an F-22 glided alongside the aircraft, silent, majestic, deadly. Its gray silhouette matched her window like a reflection of the past she tried so hard to outrun. Passengers around her gasped, some confused, some terrified. A few reached for their phones instinctively, but she did not. She stared, unmoving, as though locked in a moment that the world around her couldn't understand. The fighter pilot inside the F-22 studied the cabin through his visor. He had been instructed to establish visual contact with passengers and crew, looking for signs, panic, threats, violence. His gaze passed row by row until it stopped. Stopped on her. Something about her posture, her composure, something familiar. He pressed a button, switching to a secure, encrypted military channel. A channel not used for civilians. A channel used only in extreme cases. The second F-22 took position on the opposite side, forming a tight escort pattern. To anyone on the ground watching radar data, it looked like a coordinated response to a potentially dangerous aircraft. But in the sky, something else was happening. The woman knew what this meant. Intercepts weren't random. They weren't dispatched without reason. Something had gone wrong, critically wrong, to bring F-22s this close. And suddenly, a sinking feeling washed through her. She understood the risk. She understood what the jets were prepared to do if the situation worsened. And then, through her window, she noticed a detail that made her breath catch in her chest. The F-22 pilot was signaling, not with hand gestures, not with lights, but with something she recognized from a world she no longer belonged to. A recognition code, a simple, unmistakable pattern only a trained aviator would react to. A pattern tied to a classified call sign. Her call sign, a name she hadn't heard in years, a name she never expected to hear again. The pilot wasn't just watching her. He was identifying her. He was calling her by the identity she had left behind. She was not just a passenger anymore, and the sky around her had just become a battlefield of decisions only she knew how to face. The moment the woman in seat 14A recognized the coded signal, the sky around her seemed to tighten. It wasn't the kind of fear that ordinary passengers felt when seeing a fighter jet. It was a deeper kind of awareness, the awakening of instincts she had kept buried for years. Her past, carefully folded away, sealed, and hidden, had just been pulled open at 37,000 feet. The F-22 outside her window held its position with surgical precision, wings steady, cutting through thin air with perfect balance. It wasn't just escorting, it wasn't just monitoring. It was waiting for a response only one person on that aircraft could understand. Her pulse steadied even as adrenaline surged quietly through her. She had trained for moments far more dangerous than this. But this wasn't a mission. This wasn't a battlefield she had willingly stepped onto. She was a civilian now, a passenger, a soul trying to live beyond the shadows of her old identity. Yet now those shadows were back, and the sky had called her name. Passengers around her whispered nervously, unsure if they should panic or record. Some lifted their phones. Some froze. Some squeezed armrests until their knuckles turned white. But no one truly understood what was happening. To them, this was an unprecedented, terrifying mid-air scene. To her, it was a language, a code, a reminder. Above the clouds, the commercial aircraft held its altered course. The cockpit remained sealed, overwhelmed with cascading system errors that the pilots were desperately trying to contain. Unseen by the passengers, one of the plane's primary communication modules had failed completely. Screens glowed with silent warnings. Inputs lagged. Navigation systems flickered. What looked like a stable flight from the cabin was, in reality, a fragile struggle between malfunction and control. And on the ground, these malfunctions looked like something far worse. Air defense teams reviewed the data: course deviation, communication blackout, low response from transponder signals. Every second the plane remained unresponsive increased the threat level, a threat that had to be managed, a threat that, if escalated, left the military with only limited and devastating options. The woman knew those options. She had once stood in briefing rooms where worst-case scenarios were drilled into her with absolute clarity. A commercial aircraft flying toward restricted airspace without communication was not treated lightly. Her eyes moved from the fighter jet outside to the cabin crew, who still tried to maintain normal routines despite the growing tension. The lead attendant walked down the aisle with forced calm, but the strain showed in her tightened posture. She felt something was wrong too, but didn't know what. No one knew, except one person. Then the second F-22 slid closer to the aircraft, mirroring the first. The twin jets now formed a protective yet warning formation. It was the final step before a forced intervention. The sky, once wide and peaceful, now felt like a controlled arena with rules she remembered all too well. The woman exhaled slowly, steadying her mind. Years of training reawakened in silent layers, situational awareness first, analysis next, decision-making after. She scanned the cabin. Panic wasn't erupting yet, but fear simmered beneath the surface. One wrong move from anyone or one wrong signal from the aircraft, and fear could break loose like a storm inside a confined space. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had wanted a peaceful life, a life away from cockpits, away from missions, away from coded signals. But the sky didn't care about the lives people wanted. Sometimes it called people back without permission. Outside, the lead F-22 shifted its angle, subtly dipping its wing. Another coded movement. Another message. Not a warning. A request. They weren't asking for surrender. They weren't signaling threat. They were asking for identification, her identification. Her call sign, a name that existed only in military files and encrypted logs. A name she had abandoned but never erased. The pilot inside the fighter jet wasn't just performing protocol, he was reaching out directly to her. He had recognized something. Maybe her profile. Maybe her last deployment file. Maybe the reason she disappeared from active duty. Whatever it was, he saw her. And he was asking her to respond in the only way she could. To him, she wasn't Seat 14A. She was a former operator with a history sealed under layers of clearance. Someone the military considered gone, alive, but gone. Yet here she was, on a malfunctioning aircraft intercepted, by fighters who believed someone on board might help clarify the situation. Meanwhile, tension rose in the radar center on the ground. The aircraft was approaching a sensitive airway. If it crossed a certain invisible line in the sky, the threat level would escalate sharply. Every minute mattered. The chain of command waited for the jet pilots to report visual assessment. They waited for signs. They waited for justification, either to hold fire or to prepare for the unthinkable. But the woman noticed something crucial: the slight uneven motion of the aircraft, the subtle yaw, the faint vibration under her feet. The symptoms weren't of a hijacked flight, they were of a technical failure. A serious one that might soon affect the plane's ability to stay stable. Passengers looked around anxiously. Parents held their children closer. People who had been asleep now sat upright, alert and confused. The woman kept her gaze fixed on the F-22. She understood the risk to the passengers. She understood the risk to the ground. She understood what would happen if the plane didn't regain communication soon. Not by taking control, not by revealing her identity to the passengers, but by responding to the jets in a way only a trained operator would know. A signal, a movement, something subtle but clear enough for the pilots outside to understand that someone capable was on board. But even that decision carried weight. Revealing her past, even silently, meant opening a door she had closed forever. She looked at the passengers one more time. Ordinary people, families, strangers, innocent lives sitting inches away from fear, unaware of how close they were to decisions made far above them. The F-22 outside tilted slightly again, waiting. Her call sign echoed in her mind like a whisper from an old world. She breathed in. And finally she made a choice. A choice that would pull her back into a life she walked away from. A choice that would change the fate of the aircraft, the fighter jets, and everyone aboard. She raised her hand toward the window, slow, precise, intentional. And with that single movement, the sky received its answer. The woman's hand rose slowly, a controlled, deliberate motion reflected faintly in the window beside her. To the passengers around her, it may have seemed like she was simply steadying herself during turbulence. But to the pilot inside the F-22, flying only meters away, the meaning was unmistakable. It was a response, a confirmation, a message from someone trained. The fighter pilot acknowledged the movement. With a subtle shift of the jet's position, another coded signal, barely noticeable to civilian eyes. It was the kind of silent communication used only when radios couldn't be trusted or when secrecy mattered more than words. And now, above the clouds, that system of airborne gestures reactivated between two people who had never met but shared the same world of classified knowledge. Inside the aircraft, the woman lowered her hand gently, maintaining calm. Her heart was steady now, not because the danger had diminished, but because she had accepted something crucial. She was no longer just a passenger caught in a crisis. She was part of the solution. Whether she liked it or not, she had stepped back into a role she thought she had walked away from forever. Meanwhile, the commercial jet continued its subtle, unstable drift. The malfunctions in the cockpit grew more complex by the minute. Systems that once provided clear guidance now flickered. Inputs lagged. Backup modules struggled to compensate. The pilots were fighting a quiet, unseen battle, unaware that the outside world had mobilized because of their silence. Far below, in the Air Defense Command Center, tension sharpened. Every officer watched the aircraft's trajectory with rising concern. It was inching closer to a restricted zone, a line that, once crossed, would trigger irreversible actions. The intercepting F-22 streamed real-time visual reports. But without communication, the threat classification remained elevated. Command needed an answer. The fighter pilots needed a sign. And the woman in seat 14A had just given one. She observed the jet's confirmation movement outside her window. It was brief, but full of meaning. The F-22 pilot had recognized her response. He understood that someone on board could read the signals. Someone trained. Someone aware. Someone who could help clarify the situation. But her role was far from finished. One signal wasn't enough. The jets needed assurance. They needed to know whether the aircraft was under control or whether danger lurked inside. The woman's recognition wasn't a solution. It was only the beginning. Passengers around her were no longer whispering quietly. Fear had grown into a visible presence in the cabin. People scanned the windows, noticing the two fighter jets keeping formation. A few passengers breathed rapidly. Some clutched armrests. Others prayed silently. The cabin crew struggled to maintain composure while trying to calm the uneasy. Atmosphere spreading seat by seat. All it would take was one loud panic to turn the cabin into chaos. The woman breathed deeply, grounding herself. She couldn't reveal her past to the passengers. She couldn't stand up and take control openly. Her role in this moment required invisibility, intervening without being seen, guiding without being known. She observed the aircraft again, focusing on its movement. The subtle vibration under her feet was growing more pronounced. Something in the stabilizer was struggling. Not enough to cause immediate loss of control, but enough to signal worsening mechanical conditions. If the issues increased, the aircraft might drift deeper into restricted airspace. She knew what that meant. The jets would have to act, and their actions would not be gentle. Outside, both F-22s adjusted their formation. Slightly, a synchronized motion that untrained eyes would see as normal flight behavior. But she recognized it instantly. It was a posture shift indicating readiness. They were preparing for escalation, the kind of escalation that put every life on board at risk if misinterpreted. She leaned closer to the window, keeping her movements small and controlled. She needed to send another signal, one that would inform the jets, that the aircraft wasn't hijacked, that the threat was not internal, that the pilots were not compromised, that this was a technical malfunction and nothing more. But how? Her mind raced through the old standardized signaling system. The cabin lights flickered occasionally from the electrical issues, so relying on interior signals wouldn't work. She needed something simple and unmistakable. Then she noticed the reflective emergency card in the seat pocket. A flat surface capable of catching sunlight. A tool. She carefully slid it out, keeping her actions subtle so passengers wouldn't misread her intentions. She angled it slightly, testing how the sunlight hit it. A beam reflected softly. It wasn't strong, but it was enough. Enough to send a coded flash. A flash pattern known only to a handful of trained military personnel. She hesitated only once. Using this pattern meant exposing her identity, even if no one on board recognized it. The fighter jet pilots, however, would understand exactly who she was. They would know she once belonged to the world she had abandoned. But lives depended on clarity. She timed the aircraft's banking angle, waited for the F-22 to shift into perfect view, and sent the coded reflection. Brief, exact, unmistakable. The pilot saw it instantly. Inside the cockpit of the F-22, the pilot stiffened. The signal wasn't random light. It wasn't panic from a civilian. It was a coded reassurance from someone trained to communicate in absolute silence. A pattern meaning no hostile control. Technical failure. Do not engage. A message only someone with military aviator training would know how to send. The fighter jet responded with a sharp tilt. Confirmation. The pilot now understood the situation. The plane wasn't a threat. It was a victim of failing systems, not malicious intent. But even with that knowledge, the danger wasn't over. Because the aircraft was still drifting toward forbidden airspace, and it was still losing stability. The woman lowered the emergency card slowly, keeping it hidden. Passengers didn't notice. Their worry had grown into restless silence. She closed her eyes briefly, accepting what she had feared from the start. This wasn't just a malfunctioning flight. This wasn't just an intercept. This was becoming something bigger, something that would require her to do far more than send coded signals. The pilots on board had no idea fighter jets were preparing for emergency maneuvers. The crew had no idea the aircraft was one wrong. Turn away from triggering an immediate forced response. The passengers had no idea. Their fate was now in the hands of a woman who had once sworn she would never return to this world. But fate didn't ask permission. And in the next moments, the sky would demand even more from her. Because the F-22 on the left began descending slightly, moving into a position no passenger would understand. But she did. It was the setup for a forced corrective maneuver, a maneuver that could save the aircraft or tear it apart. She braced herself. The sky was no longer waiting. It was acting. The left F-22 dropped lower, sliding into a position that only trained eyes could interpret. To passengers, it looked like the fighter jet was simply adjusting its path. But to the woman in seat 14A, the message struck with chilling clarity. This was the beginning of a last resort. Maneuver 1, designed to force a malfunctioning aircraft back onto a safe heading. It was a move used only when a commercial jet became unresponsive and risked, crossing into forbidden airspace, a move that carried enormous risk. The commercial aircraft vibrated again, stronger this time. The subtle shudder in the metal frame hinted at systems, straining under conflicting data. The pilots in the cockpit were fighting a battle the passengers couldn't see, screens flashing warnings, instrumentation losing sync, the flight computer struggling to maintain a steady course. Outside, the F-22 on the right tightened its formation. The two Raptors now boxed the plane into a controlled corridor. The woman saw the signs, knew the sequence, and felt a heaviness settle over her chest. If the plane continued drifting, the jets would have no alternative but to escalate the maneuver. De-escalation at this altitude and speed could break everything. Passengers sensed the shift even if they didn't understand it. The atmosphere inside the cabin grew colder, heavier. People clutched seats. Babies cried softly. A few passengers whispered prayers. The cabin crew exchanged looks of worry behind forced professional smiles. The woman inhaled deeply, her mind operating on muscle memory. Years of training resurfaced, sharpening her thoughts. She had hoped her signals to the fighter jets would be enough. But the aircraft's worsening behavior told her what she didn't want to admit. Her involvement was not finished. The F-22 on the left dipped again, this time lower, more assertive. It was moving into position for a controlled nudging maneuver, using air-wake pressure to force the commercial jet's nose into a corrected heading. But the maneuver required cooperation from the airliner's control surfaces, and this aircraft was losing that cooperation. If the F-22 executed the move now, the wake turbulence could destabilize them both. She knew the F-22 pilots understood the risks. She knew they were weighing options the passengers could never imagine. And she knew the window for a safe intervention was closing. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently. The woman felt the plane sag slightly before leveling out. A system was failing, she could feel it. Years spent in the sky gave her instincts sharper than any sensor. She unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, unnoticed in the unfolding tension. She didn't stand. She didn't draw attention. She simply leaned forward, analyzing the cabin. Something in her posture had changed, a returning certainty, a controlled urgency. Her thoughts raced toward the cockpit. If the pilots were overwhelmed by cascading failures, they might not understand the severity of the intercept outside. They might not realize how close they were to a restricted boundary. They might not know, too. F-22s were preparing for a forced redirection that could turn disastrous. Someone had to reach them. Someone who could interpret military signals. Someone who knew what this meant. And she was the only one. She rose from her seat quietly, steadying herself as the cabin trembled. A few passengers glanced at her, assuming she was heading to the restroom. But she moved with intention, smooth, purposeful, toward the forward galley. A flight attendant intercepted her, gently urging her to remain seated. The woman looked at her, calm but unwavering. No words were spoken, but something in her eyes conveyed a seriousness the attendant couldn't ignore. A quiet understanding passed between them, an instinctive trust. The attendant stepped aside. The woman approached the cockpit door. She knew the protocols, knew how to signal responsibly, knew how to avoid causing alarm. She raised her hand and knocked, a calm, controlled entry request. Inside, a stunned silence followed. After a pause, the door opened slightly. The pilots, exhausted and overwhelmed, stared at her with confusion and suspicion. She didn't reveal her past. She didn't claim authority. She simply pointed toward the window and gestured downward, the universal motion, meaning fighter jets. Emergency escort. Critical course deviation. The pilots reacted instantly. For the first time in nearly an hour, someone had connected the dots. Someone had bridged the gap between cockpit confusion and military urgency. Someone had translated the silent chaos outside. The captain checked the instruments again and finally saw the data he had missed amid the alarms. The course deviation, the creeping approach toward forbidden airspace, the altitude drift, the autopilot's hidden struggle. Realization struck him like lightning. With renewed focus, he disconnected faulty systems, switched to manual controls, and fought the resistance of a confused aircraft. His co-pilot stabilized secondary systems, shutting down the malfunctioning module that caused the navigational drift. For a moment, the plane resisted, trembling violently. Passengers gasped as overhead bins rattled. The woman braced herself against the cockpit wall. The pilots held the controls with everything they had. Then slowly, painfully, the aircraft responded. It straightened. It leveled. It turned back onto course. Outside, the F-22s immediately noticed the corrected heading. Their formation shifted, less aggressive now, more protective. The lead jet climbed slightly, signaling acknowledgement. The threat level had dropped. The crisis was stabilizing. Inside, the woman stepped back from the cockpit, returning to her seat silently. No one applauded. No one knew. No one understood what she had done. But she didn't need recognition. Her past wasn't meant for applause. It was meant for moments like this. Moments where silence saved lives. Moments where a forgotten call sign echoed across the sky and found her again. As the aircraft regained full stability, passengers relaxed into hesitant relief. The fighter jets remained escorting, but at a safer distance. Now, guardians in the sky, no longer weapons of last resort. She glanced out the window one last time. The lead F-22 pilot tilted, his jet in a graceful arc, a gesture of respect, a farewell from one aviator to another, a salute to a call sign he recognized but didn't speak. The woman lowered her gaze, accepting the silent acknowledgement. She had returned to the sky just for a moment. Not as a passenger, but as who she truly was. And when the aircraft finally landed safely, neither the passengers nor the crew ever learned why 2 F-22s had escorted them home. But the sky knew. The jets knew. And somewhere, deep in the classified files she once lived inside, an old call sign flickered back to life for the first time in years. A reminder that even when forgotten, a hero never truly leaves the sky.